One of the most popular trends in the industry today is clinical dosing. But what does clinical dosing even mean? When studies are done, it's usually done on a singular ingredient with a test population. And that population usually has a range. Sometimes it's just men, sometimes it's women, sometimes it's both. And usually body weights are a range of almost 100 pounds. And what they do when they get their results is they take an average of what was effective and what wasn't. But it's an average. So some may have been effective at lower doses, some may have been effective at higher doses, and they're just coming to a conclusion on what worked. There's a lot of problems with those studies. Nothing's going to be perfect, but there are definitely some improvements that could be made. One thing I want to talk about is marginal utility. So when you have a product, you get to a certain point where there becomes a fall off. From a consumer's point of view, why would I want to take, even though I'm still benefiting here, the cost is now outweighing the benefit. So why would I want to keep paying if I knew that, for example, 6 grams of citrulline is something that everybody talks about. If I knew that 6 grams of citrulline took me here, but maybe 12 grams will take me here, is that additional amount worth double the cost? Most of the time, it's not. And most of the time, the consumer wouldn't even feel the difference in those two, maybe slightly. The other part of clinical dosing is when you have two ingredients that are being paired together, we don't really have studies on whether or not those ingredients work well together. Let's say citrulline increases blood flow, and we're just making up numbers right now. Let's say it increases blood flow, 75%. And another ingredient increases blood flow by 50%. Does that mean if we combine both ingredients together that we're increasing blood flow by 125%? Absolutely not. Right? That's just not the way it works. So these two products have to kind of work together. The problem with that is a lot of ingredients, even though it might be clinically dosed on multiple ingredients, they may actually be almost competing with each other, doing the same thing. So this 50%, if it's, let's say, L-arginine and citrulline, this 50% may turn into 20% when it's paired with a good dose of citrulline, because citrulline is more effective than standard L-arginine. It's not always best to have clinical doses of products because that makes you pay a lot more for something and not get more out of the end result. Similar situation to here. Another example of that is there was a company out there that was making a nutrient partitioner. And they took the clinical dose of one ingredient, the clinical dose of a second ingredient, and paired them together. Both ingredients on their own had good studies showing blood sugar control. Now, when they were paired together, they worked temporarily, but actually made blood sugar control much worse in the long run. So even though each ingredient was positive in its studies, when paired together, it actually gave the user a negative experience. Now, again, this is something that we don't have studies for. So when you're taking a pre-workout that has, 12 different ingredients going down, it's important to note that you want to make sure that those ingredients properly pair together and aren't competing against each other for essentially the same space. Now that works with blood flow, that works with testosterone boosters, that works with fat loss products, more than anything probably works with stimulants. So stimulants on its own, we had this conversation with Mark Glazier, the founder of NutraBio, is that stimulants are all about sweet spot, not clinical dosing. So when you're looking at dosing on a pre-workout, you have to find something that makes you feel the way you want to feel. If it's not clinically dosed, it doesn't matter because you feel the way you want to feel. Now, if it is clinically dosed, again, you have to make sure that these ingredients aren't competing against each other. That's why I'm always a fan of starting out with base ingredients and actually adding things to them. What we used to do before powdered caffeine was illegal is we would measure it out on a scale, and then we would add that with like Noopept or add in a little L-tyrosine, and we would play around with doses individually. And I understand most people don't have the patience for that, but that's how we found out what worked well for us. And comparing those results back then, this is back in 2015, a lot of what worked really well for us wouldn't be what is considered clinical dosing today, right? So those things are important to note. The other part of it is, when you're looking at clinical studies, how do we know that the ingredients and raw materials that they're using are high quality ingredients? There's no way for us to know. And are we expecting these research scientists to go out and seek the highest quality of ingredients or the best brands out there when they're testing something like a singular ingredient, like a creatine or a citrulline or an arginine or any of that? Or are they just going to the local corner store and buying a bottle that says citrulline and then testing it with 20 test subjects and figuring out from there, right? Is that corner store may sell a product that is completely different as far as quality goes to something like NutraBio. If it's half the purity, then it would take twice as much, right? So it's definitely something to consider. The other part about clinical dosing is that it's typically an average of all of the test studies, and that may be women and men, it may be a large range of body weight, and it may be a large difference in athletic capability, right? So all of those things play into effect when it comes to, clinical dosing. And again, I'm always a fan of starting out small and adding as you go. So if you have a pre-workout that you like a lot, but you want a little better pump, you could take a raw ingredient like a citrulline powder, and you could add 4 grams, which isn't the clinical dosing. And you can see how you feel. And you could add 6 grams. See if that makes you feel any better. If it does, try 8 grams. And depending on your body weight, depending on your size, depending on just your genetic makeup, you might find that certain things dosed certain ways just work a whole lot better for you. Same thing with stimulants. A lot of people find that certain stimulants might make them feel uneasy. Other people don't even notice that they're in there. And one for me that a lot of people talk about is alpha yohimbe. Some people it gives anxiety, some people cold sweats, some people don't even know it's in there and feel great from it. And that is also largely dose dependent. Again, going against feel versus clinical dosage on most items, like for instance, creatine is something that doesn't really compete with a lot of other ingredients in the way that it works. So your standard, clinical dosing per gram per body weight is probably a good reference to use. But when you're combining multiple ingredients to achieve something when they work together, that's where the clinical dosing really goes out the window. If you like this video on clinical dosing and you found it helpful, check out my video on proprietary blends and whether or not they belong in the supplement industry.